Welcome back from your weekend. So after we decided to do this show about a certain aspect of the gun policy debate in America, this morning, the news kind of coughed up a little bit more data for us. This is a CDC report, basically says that there's been an uptick in deaths from both homicide and suicide by firearm. If you read the report, it's actually the data is actually kind of noisy, and it's a little bit difficult to tell whether this is a statistical aberration or a really bad trend. I mean, it's not good no matter what, but basically these numbers had been in decline for about a decade, and they've popped back up. And when I say the data is kind of noisy, it's not a really you kind of want to see a little bit more of a solid line from location to location. That's really not exactly the way the data works. But no matter what, it's not good, and death by gun is obviously the line of death by gun has essentially crossed the line of death by car. Death by car, that trend line is going down. Death by gun doing the other thing. So none of it's good. And I'll just say one more thing before we get going, which is that as somebody covering politics, as I watched this election unfold, I really did become convinced that guns were an undocumented issue. They were a much more important issue in this past election, at least around here. I'm not an expert in everywhere else, but I could actually point to a couple of state Senate elections, which I think may have tipped on the issue of guns, although it didn't get polled about, it didn't come up in debates that much. But we live in an era where moms and dads are scared every day when they bring their kids to the school bus, and where kids and teachers go through lockdown drills as just a very uncomfortable part of their permanent realities. And that has got to weigh on people. And then you get Tree of Life, you get Thousand Oaks, you get these stories that happen so much there's almost no way to process them. So what happened was that the American College of Physicians came out with a very comprehensive report with a very comprehensive set of recommendations. And roughly about 8 or 9 days ago, a kind of argument broke out on social media, where most arguments break out. And the NRA responded to this set of recommendations from the American College of Physicians with a kind of taunting tweet. There was a picture of kind of a nutty, goofy-looking medical researcher. I guess that's who that was supposed to be. And then there was this whole sort of if you want to know the exact wording, someone should tell self-important anti-gun doctors to stay in their lane. Half of the articles in the Annals of Internal Medicine are pushing for gun control. Most upsetting, however, the medical community seems to have consulted no one but themselves. And the response to this was a pretty ferocious tweet storm of doctors talking about what it meant to stay in their lanes, that their lanes, in fact, were full of gunshot victims, that their lanes were full of digging out bullets from the vicinities of hearts. That's what their lane was like, and they were staying in their lane, but they weren't happy about what else they were finding in their lane. I hope I'm summarizing that. Anyway, we thought we would have a longer version of that conversation. Dr. Heather Scher is joining us, a radiologist from North Broward Radiologist in Florida. Dr. Richard Sidwell is joining us, a trauma surgeon at the Iowa Clinic in Iowa and one of the co-authors of the recommendations put out by the Firearm Strategy Team, which is a work group of the American College of Surgeons. This is a different report from the one I was just talking about, from their Committee on Trauma. And in studio, a regular guest with us, Dr. Harold Hank Schwartz, psychiatrist in chief emeritus now at Hartford Hospital's Institute of Living and professor of psychiatry at the UConn School of Medicine, because this has obviously a mental health and psychiatric dimension as well. But Dr. Heather Scher, I'm going to begin with you, and first of all, ask if I summarized that's the initial flurry, anyway, of communications between the NRA and the world of people who care for trauma victims. Is that kind of the way it unfolded, at least to your reckoning?
Yeah, that's what's started this latest round of doctors engaging in the debate about gun violence and wanting to address this as a public health issue. Was the NRA's tweet saying the doctors should stay in their lanes. It's funny, the dichotomy. You look at the picture, you have kind of this doctor that looks like Doc Brown or something from Back to the Future. He looks like he's reading like Galileo in the picture on the tweet where they challenge doctors to stay in their lanes. And then very shortly after that, doctors responded by posting pictures of what it means to care for a trauma patient, what our reality is. And, there's no one who's more immersed and is more intimately associated with the toll of gun violence in our society than physicians right now.
So, Dr. Rick Sidwell, you're very close to this issue by dint of having worked on this report, but I'm guessing that the way it unfolded on social media is not a good place to have some kind of reasonable debate about a complex issue about which people already feel quite impassioned. I'm guessing this isn't probably the way that you wanted this debate to take place.
Well, Colin, first, thanks for having me, and Heather and Hank, thanks for being here. These are important conversations. The whole Twitter thing, that was not necessary. That was unfortunate because really the report of recommendations or policy statement from the ACP, that has some stuff in there that is legitimate items for discussion, and you may agree with it or you may not agree with it. And then the NRA, their editorial that they wrote actually was a reasoned response that had some arguments against the positions that were being advocated by the ACP. But anyway, it was the way of introducing that report. Mm-hmm. Of the stay in your lane, anti-gun doctors having, a curious hobby, etc. That was so demeaning, and it highlights to me that a complex issue like this, a gun, and I like the way that you say it of gun policy, not gun control debate. That this type of a conversation, you can't do it 140 or 280 characters at a time on Twitter. And so my real guess is that the very policy or the editorial that the NRA was promoting through the tweet, my guess is that most folks didn't actually read the editorial because the tweet itself was so divisive, if you will.
Right. So, Hank, I know that you regard this the lane that's being talked about as a legitimate lane for people who are practicing internal medicine or trauma surgery or psychiatry. I mean, as a psychiatrist, what has this debate, what has this set of policy questions meant to you? I mean, what's uppermost in your mind, I guess?
Well, the trauma surgeons and other physicians in the ED are dealing every day with the horrendous physical outcomes of all of this gun violence, and psychiatrists are dealing with, I guess, a somewhat less dramatic portion of the spectrum of harm, but one that is daily repeated in our offices, in our emergency rooms, and in our hospitals, and that is the impact, especially on children, of living in unsafe communities, having unsafe experiences, and experiencing all of the trauma that would naturally flow from that. And there are the elements of trauma, and then there are the long-term consequences that lead to school failure, to aggression and violent acting out of the children themselves, and just a repetition of the cycle of violence. And psychiatrists see it as well as surgeons and internists, and we all very much are in that lane.
Rick, I want to ask you and Heather both about this. So when I go to see my primary care physician, I think we've stopped having this conversation. But when I go in for a checkup, he says, "You ride a bike, right? Do you wear a helmet?" That kind of thing. And I think once or twice he has said, "Is there a gun in the house?" And the answer is no. And so we kind of stop there. But I mean, I would imagine there's sort of a protocol of questions. How is it stored? Who has access to it? Have you thought about risks and stuff like that? But one of the things that the ACP report talked about was the issue of physician gag laws. There are physician gag laws, I think, in at least 13 states that actually attempt to prohibit physicians from asking that kind of question. What's your thought about that?
I'll tackle that one. My general opinion is that the government doesn't belong in that deep of detail in the doctor-to-patient relationship.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that's my general opinion as a physician. Now, that said, I understand where some of the concern comes from, and it's one thing for a physician to be talking with patient about legitimate health issues, and then it's another thing for physician to be interjecting personal bias and whatnot. And so that's where the line has to be walked. And that's a physician thing, and that's a learning thing that doctors need to learn through medical school and need to learn through their through their mentors. It's not something that in my opinion, that government needs to be involved in that depth of the doctor-patient relationship.
Right. So you're saying that's a debate that can occur within the profession, but probably not government talking to the profession.
That's, I don't know, Heather, you may have different opinion on that, a different thought, but that's my thought.
Well, Heather, you live in a state that has probably the toughest and most notorious set of physician gag rules, and I know they've been litigated, so tell us about that.
Well, let me take a step back first.
Okay.
Let me just put this in perspective where I think doctors belong in this discussion with patients. So in the U.S. in 2016, we had 15,000 deaths in this country from homicide, gun-related, and 24,000 from suicide. Okay, so gun violence is a huge umbrella of problems. 60% of gun deaths are suicide. Think about that. And in the homicide umbrella, we have domestic violence is a big player, drug and alcohol fueled feuds. Substance abuse comes into play. Crime related, that's another category. And then the third category, which is very small, it's a couple hundred deaths a year, but that's unintentional shootings. And that's where, this started with doctors asking patients about guns. It was, largely the pediatricians in Florida in terms of their screen, asking if there were choking hazards in the house, the bleach bottles were put away, if there was a pool fence, they would ask parents if there were guns in the home. Because it's been shown that guidance and counseling patients on safe storage of guns prevents gun-related deaths and injury in children. The other context where physicians may ask about guns is in the context of dementia, Alzheimer's, where accidental gun deaths occur. So I don't think physicians are just making small talk about guns. I think that, it's in the course of their preventative health interview in terms of trying to prevent death and injury, particularly the pediatricians.
Well, Hank, I'm guessing that if I'd said that I had a gun, my doctor, well, I don't know what he would have said, but let's just say he might have said, well, you know what? You get depressed sometimes. I've been treating you for 25 years. You get depressed. You should understand that having a gun in the house, may not be the best thing for you on those occasions in which you're sort of feeling like life doesn't mean anything. I'm exaggerating this a little bit for purposes of conversation, but I would assume that you would think that that's a legitimate conversation for a physician to be having with me.
When you're working with a depressed patient, finding out whether there's a gun in the home is actually a critical part of the assessment, and to fail to do that is to be practicing outside of the standard of care. 50 to 70%, depending on the study, of adults who have committed suicide have seen their primary care doc in the 30 days prior to the suicide event. So imagine if primary care doctors, because, depression and suicide, that's just a matter for the psychiatrists, and if something serious really starts to happen, fell away from ever inquiring when a depressed patient appeared to them as to whether a gun was in the home. The presence of a gun in the home is one of the most dangerous environmental factors in the completion of suicide. And the evidence that the gun, what's the follow-up question as to whether there's a gun in the home? It might be that it should be removed, but certainly it should be that it's locked in a place where one cannot reach it impulsively. And so many suicides occur within an impulsive 10 minutes of the first suicidal thought. So appropriate storage of the gun, removal of guns in homes where there are suicidal folks are really critical, and that's just an absolute part and parcel of psychiatric evaluations and care.
So Rick Sidwell, your relationship with guns is going to be a little bit different from probably Hank's and Heather's. And a lot of the conversation we're having has a philosophical underpinning to it, right? What are guns? Are they a fundamentally unsafe consumer product that you should really worry about if you have in the home? Or are they sort of an article of American life that can be used for both good and bad? There's certainly a lot of people who want to have guns who don't want to have them in places where they've got to undo a combination lock and maybe do some kind of number code on the hand grip because they think they have them in the home for personal defense. So I don't know. I mean, maybe react to this. It's okay to say you're a gun owner, right?
I am. So yes, we own firearms. I have them at my house, and in full disclosure, I am a member of the NRA, and I make no apology for that. Those positions aren't mutually exclusive, though. So you can be a responsible gun owner, you can be a member of the NRA, and you can still be in favor of things that we can do that make firearms as safe as reasonably possible and cut down on the preventable injuries and deaths associated with firearms.
Well,
anyway.
Yeah. Well, maybe you could just say a little bit more about the team that you were on. This is the American College of Surgeons. This was a trauma report on guns. How was it? Did it say radically different things from what the ACP report said?
Well, Colin, do you mind if I back up just
Sure.
a little bit, because you mentioned just some of the different narratives, and I think that's important for everybody to understand. Is that really, there are two dominant narratives held by the American people. And one narrative is that firearms are generally harmful, generally unnecessary in our civil life, and that by the presence of firearms actually decrease personal liberty because of increased harm. And so people who subscribe to that narrative see the term gun control as violence control. There's another completely opposite narrative that people subscribe to, where firearms are considered generally beneficial and in fact are necessary for personal protection and safety, and that it's a constitutionally protected right. And so people who subscribe to this narrative see firearms as emblematic of freedom, and so the term gun control translates to freedom control. With these two broad narratives, the more that one side attacks the other side, the more it makes people entrenched into their own beliefs.
Mm-hmm.
What actually doesn't get talked about is that there's a big middle ground that people agree upon.
Mm-hmm.
And in general, people can agree that liberties are protected by the Constitution, that violence is a major cause of preventable death and suffering, and that working together, that we can do a better job of understanding and addressing the underlying causes of violence, and that working together we can make firearm ownership as safe as possible.
Rick, isn't the middle ground bigger than that? I mean, I don't know if this is a middle ground or not. 6 in 10 people in exit polls in the last election said they want more gun control. They want stronger gun control. And certainly when you poll on background checks, on making background checks more pervasive, tightening loopholes and stuff like that, you get way over 6 in 10. That's a consensus item, although the pushback tends to come from the NRA.
To argue just a little bit, consensus isn't the same as compromise, and consensus isn't the same as majority. Consensus means everybody.
Mm-hmm.
That's consensus, and so 60%, one way or another, that's majority.
Right. But I'm saying background checks, you can get way higher than 60%.
So it's with it's with this idea that there is a common middle ground, that where there's some broad agreement about principles. It was with that foundation that then our work group. So our work group is made up of 22 members of the American College of Surgeons Committee on Trauma. 18 of the members are not only surgeons, but are firearm owners. And the idea with this whole thing was that firearm owners need to be part of the solution, because all too often firearm owners are seen as part of the problem rather than the solution. And so we were tasked with what are some recommendations that can be consensus recommendations, meaning we all agree, as firearm owners, we agree, that can be made. And so that was where this work group came from. Our recommendations there are some similarities, some overlap with the position statement that was put out by the ACP that started the whole stay in your lane thing. So there's some overlap that's there.
But some
so
difference.
that's the background of
all right.
where
Okay.
I'm
So
coming from.
I'm just Rick. I'm just going to pause this conversation so we can grab a quick break. We'll come back with more of Hank and of Heather and of Rick after this. So we're back. We're talking about the medical establishment's response to critical issues in gun policy with Dr. Heather Scher, radiologist with North Broward Radiologists in Florida, Dr. Rick Sidwell, trauma surgeon at the Iowa Clinic in Iowa, Dr. Hank Schwartz, psychiatrist in chief emeritus at Hartford Hospital's Institute of Living. So Hank, this is something that you wrote about quite recently in the Hartford Courant. I feel as though when Sandy Hook happened, as a journalist, even though I didn't go down there, I didn't see the bodies come out or anything like that, but just like staying on the air all day talking about it and then covering it for days and days afterwards, it really kind of scarred me. It was a really traumatic thing to just have those ideas and images in my mind. So much so that when the Boston Marathon bombing happened not too long after that, I actually had kind of a panic attack in the hallway out here. I thought, I don't even know if I can do this again. But there's a way in which we may be becoming inured. You talk about massacre fatigue. You know, we had Tree of Life, and then we had Thousand Oaks. Some kind of threshold, I think, was also crossed in the sense that several of the people who survived Thousand Oaks had survived Las Vegas. You are now living in a country where you can directly survive as a participant more than one gun massacre. So I don't know. As a clinician, what do you make of that?
Well, I think that it's interesting to note that when Thousand Oaks happened, it seemed as if it fell off the news cycle. It fell off the front pages just a little bit quicker, actually considerably quicker than the massacre that just had immediately preceded it, which was, of course, at Tree of Life in Pittsburgh. I found myself wondering how that could happen. And at the same time, I found myself wondering, when Thousand Oaks happened, how can we possibly pay attention to what has just happened when we're still reeling from what happened 11 days ago? I think what you're describing, the traumatization that you experienced covering this as a journalist, which is a kind of vicarious traumatization, is happening within the news media. I think it's happening actually to all of us. When Sandy Hook happened, it was riveting. There had been prior horrible massacres, Virginia Tech, of course, and Columbine, but it was possible then to look back all the way to the Charles Whitman Texas Tower shooting and conceptualize the whole course of events that had gone from Texas to Sandy Hook. Since Sandy Hook, it has become impossible. The one incident occurring so rapidly upon another, I write about massacre fatigue. It's a kind of compassion fatigue. It's a gradual erosion of our ability to stay engaged, to hear the names once again to be as emotionally invested and engaged in what has happened as we were in the last one or the one before. I think it impacts you as a journalist and other journalists. It impacts the physicians and clinicians who have to care for people after these disasters, and it's impacting us as a society as we all do become somewhat inured. One of the really dangerous things that's happening, though, is that as we become inured, I believe that people who are on the edge, people who are on the precipice, are just becoming more and more disinhibited. There is, the press calls it a copycat phenomena. I think of it as a kind of disinhibition in which the social norms just change and it becomes more normal to be able to act out in this horrendously violent way. So we have these kind of two competing or contrasting trends in which we can keep up with it less and less, but those who may be more likely to engage in violence are probably, their predisposition is just enhanced. I call this the disinhibition of the disturbed.
So, Dr. Heather Scher, you're a group of people. You're trauma surgeons, radiologists, emergency room doctors, and nurses. Let's say nurses too. They chimed in as part of this debate that was going on. And I think maybe one of the good things about a kind of flame war on Twitter, if there can be a good thing about it, is that you reminded the rest of us this is something that you guys can never get inured to. It is so direct and so visceral, what you see on a regular basis. Maybe you could say a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I mean, I spent my whole career in a level 1 trauma center, and handgun injuries are as routine as, just bread and butter medicine in the United States. That's not the case in other countries in America. Mass shootings really strike fear in the heart of every American. It's what gets people's attention. But that's a very small fraction of what we see on a day-to-day basis. Most of it doesn't even make the news. I cared for patients after the massacre at the Fort Lauderdale airport, which was a handgun massacre, basically, is what the weapon he had, and then also in the wake of Parkland, where the gunman had an assault rifle. They were both horrific. And, you meet the patients, you meet the families, and you're part of the community that suffers after these instances. After the Parkland, our whole community, all of South Florida, was really terrorized by what happens. The societal toll is tremendous from the mass shootings. They're like acts of terror.
Rick, I was teaching college undergraduates at the time of Parkland, which Heather just mentioned. And one of the things I could tell in this group of students that the response from the Parkland students was going to be kind of a major event in these college students' lives, because they hadn't seen members of their own generation sort of come forward and say, look, we can't wait any longer. We can't wait for you to decide you're ready to help us or accumulate enough agreement in a middle ground. This is something we just don't want to live with at the level that we're living with. And I don't know, what is your response to this? I mean, in the previous segment, you and I were talking a little bit about sort of figuring out what the middle ground is. There are people who just don't want to wait that long, and you can kind of understand that, right?
Oh, sure. Sure. I understand the sense of urgency to do something. We also have to understand that everybody's do something isn't the same for everybody else. And so we can't just do something. We have to do something that, one, everybody can agree with, and two, we have to do something that actually works. We keep kind of dancing over one of the things that is so important, and Heather's mentioned it twice now, and I don't want to at all reduce the importance of the things that we see on the news, the mass shootings that we see on the news. I don't want to at all reduce that importance. But we can't lose sight that that's a small sliver of the real problem that is injury and death associated with firearms. Mm-hmm. And we have to tackle the big problem. We can't. Anyway, I wanted to go back to something that Hank had said, because I'm very interested in his opinion on this about the idea of compassion fatigue or becoming inured. One of the recommendations that we make in our report is actually for the media to not censor, but for the media to take somewhat of an editorially muted approach to the coverage of these big events, specifically to help eliminate some of the notoriety that the assailants may desire. Hank, what do you think? Is that is that?
So I think.
What do you think?
I think that's a complex question. I served on the Governor's Sandy Hook Advisory Commission here in Connecticut, and I am reminded of how viscerally offended family members were every time the mention of that mass shooter's name was made, either in a public meeting or on the air. And I think we need to be sensitive to that. At the same time, I think it's a complex issue to try to control the way that the press can report these events. As you yourself mentioned, there's a difference between things we'd like to do and things that we actually can do. And one other thought I have about that is that while, yes, I do believe that the reporting and the notoriety of shooters does compound the issue and incite the next shooter. At the same time, I believe that as we learn more about the environment of the shooter and the life history of the shooter, and we're able to demonstrate, even retrospectively, as inadequate as this is, that we can at least learn about these issues, that may contribute to the sense of safety that we as a public have. I'm concerned that if we stopped reporting in depth about these issues, that we would have an unmodulated contagion of fear, not modulated in the way that information can help. There are so few things that really can help to restore our sense of safety, and information, frankly, is one of them. So I'm kind of torn about that recommendation.
Rick, as a member of the media, let me just say, I think that ship has totally sailed. I mean, look, if the Washington Post and the Hartford Courant and the New York Times don't do curated, responsible coverage of this stuff, it's going to be done, but it's going to be done on social media by guys in Macedonia making stuff up, and conspiracy theorists in this country. People would consume a tremendous amount of information about something like Sandy Hook, whether we did it or not. As it was, we've had to fight an incredible battle against these Alex Jones people who claim Sandy Hook never happened. We've had to produce a tremendous amount of documentary evidence just to fight back that notion that it wasn't a false flag in order to create more of an appetite for gun control, that children and teachers really did die in that place. We also had to fight for records that the state didn't want to share that I think did have the potential to elucidate this matter in the ways that Hank's talking about. I don't buy this whole the media is the problem right now. You could have maybe made that argument before there was sort of amateur social media, but not now, right?
I think that's right, and I would add that the number of incidents that we're having now, I think we have to escalate the way that we talk about this. This is equivalent to a ground war on American soil, and while it's true that you can't have a ground war without weapons, so weapons are clearly a central issue, you've got to have reporting about the war, and reporting that tries to keep the record straight. You're completely right that the way that information is dispensed, and with so much inaccuracy on social media, really requires a press report that is accurate and timely and informative, and I think ultimately helpful.
I want to do something that I periodically do. Well, we've got a call from Zach from Woodbury. Maybe I'll start there. I'll start with you this way. So Zach wanted to know what the recommendations were of your report. I'm just going to ask you, Rick, just in the interest of time, in terms of the report that you and the other 21 professionals were involved in, is there one thing that really jumps out at you? Like if I could hand you a magic wand and say, you can get this thing passed, no problem. You need Congress, you need the president, you need a constitutional amendment, whatever. I'll get it for you. What's the thing that you wish would get done?
Our recommendations, there's 13 specific recommendations centered around approximately 10 or so principles. I suppose, Hank or Zach, if you wanted me to pick one, if I could only get one of the recommendations, it would be for nonpartisan, federally funded research that is done commensurate with the level of public health impact that firearms have.
Say a little bit more so we understand what you're talking about.
So, if I just had to pick one of them, the research, so our true knowledge into injury and death related to firearms is very small compared to our knowledge, our research into any other medical condition, any other health condition. There's reasons that is like that right now. There's reasons that we have gotten to where there is very little federal funding for firearm-related research. But if we really want to make evidence-based decisions about what our gun policy is going to be, we need to have the evidence.
Right. So
but that has to be done. Has to be done in a nonpartisan way.
I have to underscore that. I think most doctors would agree with that. You know, you talk about kind of the impulse to just do something. Well, we have to do something that works. And it's not clear what that is right now because there's just such a paucity of research out there. Since 1996, when the Dickey Amendment was put in place, really we have a complex problem with gun violence in terms of all of its various flavors, whether it's suicide or domestic violence, related unintentional shootings in the homes. We have a variety of laws on the books, and we need to know which ones work. And you know, we have $1 billion invested in the opioid epidemic for research. We have almost no money invested in gun violence with all these complex questions that need to be answered so that when we invoke policy that we're doing something that's going to be effective.
Right, and I think that 1996 law that you're invoking here, Heather, is the one that mandates that none of the funds made available for injury prevention and control at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention may be used to advocate or promote gun control, which, Heather, seems to have had kind of a chilling effect overall on the kind of research you're talking about.
Right. Well, at the time when that amendment, it was kind of a reactionary move by the congressman. They also cut funding for gun violence. They took the $2.6 million that was earmarked for gun violence research, and they put it in traumatic brain injury. So they said, you can't use funds for gun violence, and in fact, the existing funds you have, we're going to move it over here. So after that point, there's a two-thirds reduction in published papers since that time. Most of the medical studies that are done, you know, are funded by the CD. Well, I mean, most of it honestly is funded by industry, med tech devices, and pharmaceutical companies, to be honest. But 38% of funding in this country is from the CDC and the NIH, and that's what would be the funding source for gun violence research. And that's a vacuum right now. There's no funding there for gun violence, or very little.
I'd like to add to that just for a moment. You know, sure. Rick, I think that the position paper of the American College of Surgeons is really quite good, and it's quite reasonable in its position of trying to seek compromise. But on an issue like this, I'd have to ask, what kind of compromise can there or should there be to the principle that the federal government will not allow funding for gun violence research? How is that? How is finding some compromise there a reasonable position? That is such an outrageously partisan position to have taken to begin with, it's not paralleled by the approach to any equivalent death-causing incident or disease. So
what I'm going to do is let that question hang in the air for a second. Rick can ponder his response. We've got to take a really quick break here just so we can get back and have a full final segment here. So stay with us, and we'll wrap up this conversation.
Today's show was produced by Betsy Kaplan, with help from me, Kyone Wolf. The part of Bill Curry was played by Ted Nugent. On tomorrow's show, we revisit our conversation about the place of women in evolution. Now, back to Colin.
That sounds kind of ominous, actually. It's not, I promise. So we're having a conversation right now about gun policy and about the medical community's response to gun policy. I think it's a really good conversation, too. I'm so glad we got these three terrific guests who are Dr. Heather Scher, radiologist for North Broward Radiologist in Florida, Dr. Rick Sidwell, trauma surgeon at the Iowa Clinic in Iowa, one of the co-authors of recommendations put forth by the Firearm Strategy Team, which is a work group of the American College of Surgeons Committee on Trauma, Dr. Hank Schwartz, psychiatrist and chief emeritus at Hartford Hospital's Institute of Living and professor of psychiatry at the UConn School of Medicine. So, Rick Sidwell, when we last were active here, Hank was posing the question, how do you find middle ground in a situation where, there's a law on the books? I mean, you're a medical scientist, medical people, science people, they tend to like data and research and stuff like that. There's a law on the books that inhibits that to a certain degree. I don't know, what is your take on that?
Well, yeah, again, one of our recommendations coming from our work group, and again, this is a work group of firearm owners, one of our recommendations is that there is research for firearm injury and firearm injury prevention, and that needs to be funded at a federal level commensurate with the burden of injury. Our language here, right before break, our language is very important. So the idea isn't to have, I get where the Dickey Amendment comes from. The Dickey Amendment says we can't use prevention money to advocate or promote gun control. Well, that in a sense makes sense. We don't want to, or we shouldn't fund research with a presupposed objective to advocate or promote gun research. We need to fund research that looks into the root causes of violence, how can we effectively store firearms, how can we do effective counseling and training, what are the effective policies that lead to restricting firearms for violence-prone individuals, etc. So yes, we need to do the research. Absolutely.
Of course, a lot of people.
It needs to be done in a nonpartisan manner.
Right. A lot of people would say that everything that you just said puts sort of toes on the line towards the kind of gun control where ideas where you get pushback. But Heather, I want you to react to that too.
Well, there's this fear that there's this slippery slope that that the answer is to take guns away, and that's not at all the answer. These problems are very complex. Suicide, for example. What can we do to curb suicide? Well, we need better mental health care. We need more inpatient mental health beds. We need long-term care for patients who are mentally ill and depressed in terms of, preventing suicide. And then there's the gun part of the equation. There's question. There's not science that shows it. Are waiting periods effective, to make it, not an impulsive act? Would red flag laws where you have someone who's depressed and they have a firearm, you're able to disarm them, would those be helpful? That's just suicide. You for domestic violence, for accidental shootings, all of there's so many different policy questions in terms of how do we curb it, and the guns themselves are only one part of the question that needs to be solved, which needs to be solved.
That is exactly,
new knowledge
Heather, you've explained that nicely. That's exactly one of our recommendations. We need good evidence in all these areas so that we can make an informed policy choice.
That's true. New knowledge is always a slippery slope in that we never know where it's going to lead. So knowledge about guns has really basically been withheld by the Dickey Amendment out of fear that it might lead down one particular direction towards gun control, suggesting that the researchers who would be doing it had a bias or predisposition, when in fact those researchers are scientists who we would hope and presume would be doing unbiased research that could have led into all of the directions of the things we just don't know about how to prevent gun injury and how to prevent the consequences of gun injuries.
Heather, I want to do with you what I did with Rick a little while ago and just give you the magic wand for a moment and just a magic wand for a policy change, something that, based on everything that you've observed and everything you know about this problem, one change that would make a big difference. What's that change?
It's funny. I would, if I could only do one thing, it would be research also, and I would have funding for research. Because, like I said, doctors are very reluctant to get behind something unless they know that it's going to work. And while there's lots of good ideas out there in terms of how to curb gun violence, we can look at states that have lower suicide rates and look at their gun laws and compare them to areas that have higher suicide rates and try and tease out, which of those laws were effective. With domestic violence, with taking guns away from people who have restraining orders and temporary restraining orders against them, we can look at areas that have don't have the law and see if, is there an impact. I would vote for funding and funding for research.
Hank, I'm not going to give you a magic wand, but I'm going to talk to you about something we've talked about a lot. I mean, not every one of these problems is a mental health problem, God knows. There's all kinds of reasons. Heather was talking about accidental shootings. There's all kinds of reasons that people die from gun violence. On the other hand, there's a mental health component to this, whether we're talking about suicide or mass shootings or whatever. And it does seem as though the infrastructure that could deal with that is going away as opposed to being enhanced.
Absolutely true. And I think when we think about the mental health component of this, I think we have to acknowledge some shooters, mass shooters and individual non-mass shooters certainly have mental illness. Some certainly don't. And many fall in between into an area that we would think of as, well, they're folks who are just not well put together or are disturbed. There are no short-term mental health solutions. There are no short-term new predictors of who's going to shoot out on the street in a gang or who's going to shoot in a mass murder situation. But clearly, both for people who are mentally ill and for the vast group of people who have issues, the fact that the mental health infrastructure is fragile in America is an approach we could take for the long term. For instance, the number of psychiatric beds in America has diminished so significantly that people wait in emergency rooms sometimes for days or even weeks to get into a bed. Everybody who needs a bed in a psychiatric hospital ought to be able to get one expeditiously, ought to be able to stay in that bed as long as is necessary to treat the episode of illness, and ought to have a kind of follow-up, wraparound networks of care that will ensure a diminished risk from in the population, over the long term. I'd add to that there's an education and school component to this, which is to say that social connectedness, empathic connectedness, the things that we consider to be a part of social emotional learning. So far we kind of think of, social emotional learning is something that we give to kids who are at risk, who have special needs, or maybe we spend a few minutes with the class here and there. But social emotional learning is one of the connecting threads for our society. Empathic connectedness needs to be emphasized in school.
All right. Thanks. It's a good place to stop. Thanks to Dr. Hank Schwartz, to Dr. Rick Sidwell, and Dr. Heather Scher. Thanks for this very good conversation. Special thanks to Betsy Kaplan, who put this conversation together. We'll be back tomorrow. We always are.